So, hello everyone. I hope you're having a great time. I see they stacked up the seats, so there's even more people, so that's even more frightening, but I still think I will pull through it. Welcome to my talk. I will be talking about the composition API, specifically about emerging patterns and best practices. I'm Thorsten, and as you can see, I was a cool kid from the get-go. But this is what I look like now, just for the people in the back. But my face is also up there, so... And up there, so yeah, a lot of me. Some short prerequisites. It would be good if you had seen Greg's talk, which I'm pretty sure all of you did, except you fell asleep because I stood there throughout the talk. It would be even better if you had played with the composition API with a plugin that Greg mentioned. So who has? Can you get a show of hands? Oh, quite some people. Okay, that's good. If you haven't, well, you might not catch all of the slides, but I think you will still find it useful. So, also one thing that I want to say is I'm talking about emerging best practices and patterns because, well, yes, we have this plugin and people are using it and people are already building libraries with it, but we are still at a stage where we as a community have to figure out how the best ways to do things are, really. So take everything that I tell you with a grain of salt, experiment yourself, contribute back to the community, and just be part of this whole adventure of coming up with the best ways of using this, right? So this is not a prescriptive talk, it's just inspiration for you to get a little bit of idea how you can do certain things, maybe. And I already mentioned libraries that are using the composition API. Those are a few of them. A lot of them are projects that provide small utility functions, sort of like a composition API Lodash. And this is also a good sign because it shows how great the composition API is suited to provide reactive utilities for your applications. And it also allows you to easily extract common code that you previously probably often wrote in your components just because it wasn't worth pulling it in a mixin and adding all of this confusion that you have a couple of mixins and you don't know what piece of code is coming from which mixin. This works much better with the composition API, which is why there are already a lot of small utility projects coming up. We also have a couple of projects like Vue Apollo, which will, on the next version, have composition functions available added to the usual API that you may know if you have used it. And we also, on the bottom right, see awesomejs.dev, which is a website that Guillaume Chau built, aka Acrium, and it's basically a package, a page where you can find great packages for your projects, not just Vue, but React, Angular, and stuff. And it's completely written, the whole website is completely written in the composition API. You can find this on GitHub, so if you want to check out how a whole website built with the composition API looks like, this is a great example. I was using those as inspiration. I was just reading a lot of code, like really a lot of code. And I collected ideas on Post-it notes. So this is, I'm sorry that the image is a bit dark. This is actually my closet in my home office, and I was just putting Post-it notes all over the wall, just of all the little bits and pieces that I noticed over time. And so I want to share with you a couple small tips and tricks to just watch out for when you write composition functions. But first of all, I want to address the elephant in the room a bit that Greg already referenced, and that is probably this question, right? Ref and reactive, which one should I use? Which one is better? Why do we have both? So this added a lot of confusion. So like 50% of the comments on the RFC that discussed this API were of that nature. And so I aimed to look at these libraries and these projects and just see what are they using. And the thumb, I didn't really count every instance. So, but my impression is that, at least in library code, this is the answer, right? So this is a lot of ref, and this is a small, lonely reactive here and there. I found it more in the awesomejs.dev repository. So maybe this is a sign that. Sorry, that was too quick. We'll make the joke later. So, but yeah, okay. I found a couple of more reactive instances in the source code of the awesome.js.dev website, which may be a hint that it's better. Refs are more suitable for libraries, but really they are everywhere. And the question that you may now have is, okay, but why? Yeah, way to go to ruin a joke. So, first of all, before I give my opinion on this, the disclaimer, most of this code I was looking at is library code. And so practices for using components in your actual applications may come out different, but we don't have a big enough, I didn't find a big enough reference number of projects that I could look at. But having said that, I think my impression is that the answer to why people are using refs is consistency. Like, sometimes reactive simply doesn't work, at least not in an ergonomic way. Like, you have to use a ref in various places, even if you prefer to use reactive when you can. And I think most developers value consistency, and so they naturally, after having tried the API, tend to just start with a ref because you can't go wrong with the ref. I have a few examples just to demonstrate this a bit. Like, computed properties are refs. They have to be because we need an object that can be reactive even if the computed property returns a boolean or a string that is updated whenever its dependencies change. And so you end up with something like this, right? You end up with a computed function that references sum.value, which is another ref, it's another computed property, and it also accesses state.x, which is a reactive object. And so I personally feel that this is the kind of problem that people are worried about. Sometimes they have to do state.x to access a reactive object, sometimes they have to sum.value to access the value of a ref. And so if you just use refs instead, you come out with nice, clean, or consistent code, right? So you don't really have to worry. You know everything that is reactive in your code is a ref. And I also don't think that this is really much more verbose, because previously we had a state.x, now we have a state.value, and if you count the letters, actually state has also 5 letters, so unless you use one-letter names for all of your reactive objects, which I don't think you want to do because it's not readable, you don't really gain much in terms of the amount of letters that you have to type. And so, to me, this is more consistent. Another instance is DOM references. This is something that Greg didn't cover in his talk, but something that is very useful. Like, everybody knows what's a ref in Vue 2, right? You use it to access a DOM element. And so in Vue 3, you do this with a ref. I use a little bit of TypeScript annotation just to give you an idea that this ref is meant for an HTML input element. And we return it from setup, and then we can use it on the input and get a reference to this element. And so this allows us to use an on-mounted hook to maybe add an event listener. Of course, usually you would use von for this, von click, but maybe imagine that you want to instead pass this element to some third library code, like select2 or whatever, that you have to include in your project. And so this is something that you also will come across. And so for templates, for references to DOM elements, you will need template refs. And so my impression is that if developers value consistency, they likely prefer refs, as those simply work everywhere. You don't have to keep in mind which is which. You don't have to keep in mind when to use one or the other. And to be honest, even though the first impression of many people is refs are very more verbose, in most situations they aren't. So the question then is reactive useless? Well, of course not. So if you want to use it, you can do this. I would not recommend against it, but I just think that references are a better starting point, because when in doubt, start with a ref. That would be like the line that I would be using here. And so it's just a question of personal preferences. You just have to accept that you can't completely get around refs. You have to work with them in many situations. But one example that I just came up with for using reactive, like if you have a reactive object that has lots and lots of properties and you want to return this from your composition function, then it's easier because you just have to return one object instead of listing all of the individual 10 or 20 refs that you have to return. But usually in my experience, when you write good composition functions, they only return a handful of things, so you're also good with returning a few refs. And you also get a great overview of what the return value actually is composed of. So on to a few examples after I take a sip. So this is an image from the RFC documentation that we have online for the composition API. And the goal of this is probably something that Greg also covered. Maybe I missed a few slides. And it's basically showing you that on the left side, with the options API, when you have a big component that does a lot of things, the different parts of your features are spread across, because some is in data, some is in computed, some is in lifecycle hooks. Whereas in the composition API, you can write whole blocks that are just talking about one feature. And so you can really see what every feature is composed of. But this can, of course, mean that you end up with a lot of code in your setup function. So for example, this is a component from the awesome.js.dev website, which does a lot of things like this cool select, like the autocomplete, searching npm. It uses GraphQL in the background for this, and all of this stuff, right? So there's a lot going on. And Guillaume, because he is like a wizard in many ways, because he's just so quick and great at working on these things, chose to do this, actually do this as in one setup function, this component. And so this means that it looks like this. So if you can read this, this is okay, because I'm not going to go through all of this. It's just to show you that you can write a big setup function, and if you're Guillaume, you can easily understand what you're doing. But the recommendation would be to, as an example to what Greg explained, to actually look what the individual features are, and then move them out of the setup function into individual functions outside of the component context, just so you can make the setup function in something that is explaining the what and not the how. So just as a little hint, because it's just too big to really go through this all, you can imagine it like this. So this is a bigger, this is maybe a reduced version of the same setup function. If you look closely, we have a function use package check, which just receives the form data. The implementation is left out, because in this function, you would do everything to check for the package, whether it already exists. And in the setup function you're seeing, we're only calling this function and getting all of the state back that we need to proceed. So when we look at the setup function, we're not worried about how this actually is implemented. We just can read what we are going to do and what the result is that we're getting back. The implementation is abstracted away. But at the same time, it can be in the same file, so we can reference it. We can jump to the definition. And so we can do this for the second, using the form validation, which also receives parameters. And in the end, we can use the use submit function that we created, which gives us a couple of other things to expose to our template. So this is just a reminder of what Greg told you, how you should approach this. My idea is to start in setup, write down what you want to do, and if you realize, hey, this is getting a little bit too much, it's pretty easy to just use features of your editor to say, hey, take this piece of code and put it in a function outside of this current scope that I'm in. And so this allows you to quickly refactor the implementation details out of the setup function into something reusable. And also, you will write a lot of these little functions, right? So you have my composition function, you're receiving a bunch of arguments. In the middle, you're using all of these great features that the composition API is exposing. And in the end, you're returning refs or objects or functions or all of them, all of these things, right? And so I will, in the rest of my talk, I will go through small examples where I deal with arguments, because now you will be getting normal objects or strings. You will also get refs as arguments. You will get reactive objects as arguments. And I'm just giving one or two tips about how to deal with this. Then I will talk about implementation tripwires, just what to watch out for when you're using the composition API to do something. I think I have one great example to give you a little bit of food for thought. And then I'm also talking about returning and how to structure the values that you are returning, how to name them, just so you can have a composition function that is easy to use for the consumer. Okay, so on to the first part. Handling refs and arguments. If you have a little function like this, we are receiving a ref as an argument. It's a ref that wraps a Boolean, so basically it's a reactive Boolean value. And we want to watch this with the composition API to do something. And so we can do this. We have a reference with a Boolean value that is called as active, and we can pass it to this function. Everything's great, right? But you can, unless you are using TypeScript, you might be confused. Maybe your editor is not up to the task right now. So when you do this, you get a stupid type error. So because you're not passing, now you're passing the actual value, you're not passing the ref. And in many situations, you don't actually want to pass a ref because you only have an initial value. You know it won't change, so why can't I pass this true value in there? Well, there are two kinds of situations, I think. In one situation, you actually want to do this. So if you know that this composition function only makes sense if you actually get a ref, if you actually have a reactive value that changes, then do a little error check, give a friendly warning to the developer, hey, you didn't pass me a ref, it has to be a ref. The isRef function is exposed from the Vue package, by the way, just so people can have a friendly developer experience when they use your composition function. And so they know that even though they may not have, in this instance, the need for a reactive value, they know that they have to provide you one. But this looks kind of weird, doesn't it, right? Like I have to wrap it in a ref just to pass it to the function, even though I don't really need the ref in my own code. Well, can we accept both a ref and static values? Yeah, that's actually pretty easily possible. And so here, don't get confused by all the TypeScript code or the TypeScript annotations if you are not familiar with them. I'm still fighting with them from time to time. But it's just to show you that the element, the first argument to this function, can either be a ref referencing an element, or it can be an element itself. And this is so that we can use it in different contexts with or without a ref. But how do we manage this? Well, we have a little wrap function that actually wraps the ref it wraps the L in a ref if it already isn't a ref. The implementation is really straightforward. It's a one-liner, right? We check, is this a ref? If so, just return the raw value that we got because we already have a ref. If it's not, then we wrap it in a ref. And you can also, of course, imagine that we can do the other thing. We can write a one-liner unwrap function to like get a ref and get the raw value out if we need it. And so a little helper like this allows us to have a little friendlier developer experience because we can say, hey, you can pass me whatever. You can pass me the raw value or you can pass me a ref to it. I can work with both. And so whether or not you're doing this is a little bit the question of a forgiving API versus a strict API, right? Because you might have situations where you actually need ref. And if the developer would pass a raw value to your function, that would actually be a mistake. So in that case, you of course shouldn't do that. But there are many situations where it's okay if you get a ref, but you don't really need it. You just want to provide the convenience to be able to work with it. Another thing to watch out for is lifecycle hooks versus watch. My general impression is that in the composition API, watches are much more useful than they are in the options API, just because they lend themselves better to dealing with side effects in the way that you write composition code. And so we get back to this example that I just had, but I removed all the TypeScript code. And what we're left with is basically we get an element, we wrap it in a ref if it isn't already, and then in onMounted, we add an event listener. In onMounted, we remove the event listener. So this is basically just a simple example to add an event listener, maybe to the document element, maybe to the window, maybe to an element from somewhere else in the document that you are not controlling with your Vue code. But it could also be a reference from a template refs, which I showed you earlier. And what could happen then is, well, the ref could be empty on mount. So because maybe you have a vif on the element and it doesn't really show up on the first mount. It only shows up after something else has happened. You will get an error. And you can't add the listener after mounted. You just do it in mounted. What if the ref changes later because you had a key on it and it's in a list, or because it was there, but then because of a vif it disappeared, and then you reintroduced it again? It's a fresh element. The event listener is gone. And so Watch can come to the rescue here, because often, instead of using lifecycle hooks, we can now use a watch very easily. We can do this. So I write a watch function, and I watch the element that I get. And so if there actually is an element, I add the event listener. If not, I just do nothing. So that covers the first problem. What if the ref doesn't have a reference to an element on mount? So now we can remove unmounted. And you're seeing that the watch function also has a third argument, which is called onCleanup. Now, this onCleanup takes a callback, and it's run whenever the watch is about to update because the value changed. So basically it's, hey, the element reference changed to a new value, so first run the old cleanup, and then run the watch callback with the new value. So how this works is like this. On cleanup, we have a function which basically removes the event listener from the old element. And now we can remove unmounted. Why? Because this onCleanup function will be called by your component when the component unmounts. So this will also be unmounting when you need it. So now we have solved both of our problems, right? Listeners are only added when the element actually exists, and when it comes to life later, we can still add the event listener automatically. Listeners are updated when the element ref changes, and they are also cleaned up when the element is gone, or when the component unmounts. And so this is not only useful with elements, mind you. This is useful in a lot of cases where previously you might have thought, okay, I do this on mount, I do this on mount, and then you realize, maybe I need it in created or in updated and maybe in activated. And so in a lot of situations, a simple watch can cover all of this for you. And it's really just 2 lines of code. Another thing to watch out for is that you should be returning computed values or read-only values instead of a plain ref. So I saw this a couple of times in the source codes that I was looking at, that people would do something like this. So first, this is the consumer. Like, we have a little use online function, which is basically just giving us a ref. It's just telling us, are we online or not, using modern browser APIs. So this is a ref, and an easy implementation could look a little bit like this. Now, don't worry about the implementation. There are 2 lines that you should be looking at. The first one is online is a ref initialized with a true value. So this is the internal ref that this function is using to track the state of whether we are online or not. And then, on the bottom of the function, you're seeing we're just returning this ref. And the ref is mutable. So I fucked up this animation, no matter. But this is mutable, so you get a ref that you can mutate outside of the composition function in this case. And that may be desirable in other situations, but in this situation here, some other code that is using this ref later in your component could actually destroy the tracking state that we are using here. So what you should be doing is something like this. You should use a computed to do this, because now internally you're using a ref to track the state, but the consumer of your function just essentially gets a read-only ref, right? So they can destroy the state that you are tracking. And if you're working with, so now we're happy, and if you're working with an object that is reactive, and you want to do the same thing, then Vue exposes a read-only function from the package. I'm sorry that I forgot to include it in the import at the top. But this allows you essentially to make the whole object read-only, which is also a good idea if you want to keep the control of actually updating this object and its properties within the composition function and not let some consumer of your function essentially mess with the state. But also, you should obviously not always do this. There are instances where you are on purpose returning a ref or a stateful object that you want the consumer to manipulate so you can watch it. And so in this instance, we're also happy because nobody can mess with this, what we have really. Okay, so I'm already a little bit over time, so I have to make this one quick. This is another example where somebody wrote a function that is essentially used to take an element and either put it into full screen or exit full screen. And you're seeing that they have is full screen everywhere, like this is pretty verbose. And I think it's because the author thought if somebody wants to deconstruct this, they can just deconstruct one property and it still has a nice name in it. It's just telling you what it does. But I don't think that it's actually a good idea. Like, because if you want to keep this as an object, if you want to keep everything as a full screen object, then you have this. Like, and this is pretty unnecessary, right? So what I would rather do is, you're in your composition function, right? So you know you're dealing with full screen. You don't have to repeat this over and over to yourself. So just use names that make sense within the context of this composition function and return in this way. Because then your consumers can simply say full screen.enter as a callback to the mounted hook, for example. And they don't have this senseless duplication of naming. And if you actually want to deconstruct this return value, you can do it, of course. And then you can simply probably rename it to something that makes more sense in the context that you're in, like name it enter full screen, or name it enter video full screen if you're referencing a video element, for example. Yeah. Okay. So I'm also a bit over time, so I'll make the rest quick, and the rest is just me saying thank you. Yeah. I know I probably lost a couple of people. I had a really hard time to figure out how to put all these small examples together so they still make sense to people coming to this topic anew. But I hope you still get some inspiration from this. And hopefully the long-ass set of functions didn't disencourage you to try it out, because I promise you don't have to work this way. Okay, so once again, thank you.